Welcome to Left, East to West with me, Nikki Hill.
And me, Tom Parkin. Glad you're with us for our latest, and subscribe and tell others about the show. This week, we'll touch on the political aftermath of a Nova Scotia snowstorm and a new study into predatory grocery prices launched in Manitoba.
And then we're going to bring you an interview with Iglika Ivanova, the co-executive director of BC Policy Solutions, as we talk about economic policies and issues that are impacting low, middle, and income and working people.
But before we get to Iglika, let's check in a couple places across Canada with a look at this week below the fold.
So it's winter in Canada, and that means snow for most. I won't overly mention here how little we've had in Vancouver this year, as it
don't,
upsets both
don't
the
rub it in,
Easterners
Nikki.
and the skiers. Well, the
Don't rub
Vancouver
it in.
skiers are suffering too with brown spots. But a heavy dump of the white stuff in Nova Scotia a few weeks ago has had an impact beyond the usual, creating a storm in provincial politics and some tough sledding for Premier Tim Houston. Give us some background on that, Tom.
Yeah, mid-January, Nova Scotians were hit by a storm dropping about 20 centimeters across the province. It was on a Sunday night, and on Monday morning, about 130,000 Nova Scotia power customers woke up to no power. Okay, not great, but 24 hours later from the storm on Monday night, power was still off for 37,000 customers. And 48 hours after, 13,000 customers still had no power. So, Nikki, you can imagine middle of winter, snowstorm, no power for 2 days. There's a lot of people not happy with Nova Scotia
Yeah.
Power's performance. So things got more unhappy next weekend when Nova Scotia Power admitted that with temperatures forecast to dip, they may not have enough generation capacity to meet heating demand. So could people please conserve electricity? And sure enough, there were some blackouts because Nova Scotia did not have enough electricity over that weekend. Nova Scotia Power was already on some pretty thin ice with a lot of people because last March a cyber hack stole at least 280,000 customer files, taking names, birth dates, addresses, driver's license numbers, and even some social insurance numbers. Nikki, I don't know why they even have those.
Wow.
Yeah, Nova Scotia Power didn't figure it out for a month, and then took another month to tell the public about it. So this is not, you know, this is not a company that is really engendering itself to the
No.
populace. So of course, this is the right time to go for an 8% rate increase, right, Nikki? Like,
Yeah,
be
it sounds like a
perfect.
perfect time to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, a rate increase needs provincial approval, and the regulator needs hearings about it. So opposition leader Claudia Chender gets herself on the hearing agenda, and late last month told the regulator that residents simply cannot afford to keep paying for this essential, expensive, and incredibly unreliable service. Now, Chender is pretty popular down there, and she is securing her party's hold on official opposition. The most recent polls, the two most recent polls, have showed her NDP at 31 and 35, up from 23 at the last election. And the reason she's doing well is she's pretty shrewd and she doesn't leave a lot of points on the table. So she didn't just go after Nova Scotia Power over hiking rates, wanting 8% more. She also went after them for hiking rates while raking in $217 million profit, up 50% in the last 4 years. And that's because, of course, Nikki, Nova Scotia Power was privatized by the
Right.
Conservatives a number of years ago. It's owned by a company called Emera, which also owns power companies in Florida, New Mexico, Bahamas, and other places where they do not have winter and heating requirements, apparently. And to cap it, Cheddar told the regulator that there should be an ownership review and maybe go back to having a public utility that keeps the profits, the $217 million in Nova Scotia. So 2 days after Claudia's headline comments at the rate hearings, the Houston government filed a document with the regulators also urging that the increase not be approved. So everyone at this point can now see that Tim Houston is kind of leading from the back of the parade. But Houston is still pretty popular. Those last two polls I mentioned showed him at 47 and 50%,
Hmm.
or his conservatives at 47 and 50% support, but that is a little down from the 53% he got on election day in 2004. Um, And opposition leaders can make pocketbook issues like this turn into turning points if voters conclude their government gives priority to the wrong people and mismanages basic stuff like keeping the
Hmm.
lights on. So, one last interesting wrinkle to this is Nikki, do you know? Do you know who Tim Houston appointed as his Minister of Energy?
Are his initials TH?
They are. You win the prize, Nikki. Yes.
Ah,
Mr. Houston made himself his own Minister of Energy. So if anybody's going to get thrown under the bus, you'd think it would be the Premier himself on this one. But Amira, 10 days ago, the owner company of Nova Scotia Power, did Houston a real favor about 10 days ago, firing the CEO of its Nova Scotia Power unit. Houston welcomed the move, but also said he would not overrule an 8% rate hike if that was to come, because that would cause market chaos.
ah,
There you go. We don't want that. No, people
compared
can
to all the
freeze in the
other
dark.
chaos. Yeah.
People can freeze in the dark, but make market chaos. That's where I draw
No
the
market
line. No
chaos.
market
Yeah.
chaos. Now, okay. Now I feel like you picked a below the fold story, especially for me.
I may have.
Predatory food pricing. Do you have some good news for me?
Yeah, I mean, I know this has been an issue of high interest to you in recent shows. So when I saw it, I was like, this is what we need to talk about more this week.
Yeah.
So
$6
um
cabbages.
yeah, exactly. And the meat and all of the things that you've been asking about. So we've seen here the Manitoba NDP recently launch something they'd committed to previously, but launching now a study on predatory grocery pricing. So looking at a way to increase affordability and reduce food costs for the public. So I figured we should talk about it. I think it's a fairly simple premise. It's interesting because they are the first jurisdiction in Canada to launch the predatory pricing study piece of this. I think, a lot of jurisdictions have been trying to look at food security, food insecurity issues because it has been a huge issue and it's an issue globally with affordability crisis going on. So, and supply chain issues like we've talked about. But this one, I think it's, government sees food costs rising. Government commits to try to figure out what their role is here and how to address the impact on the public. So this step is called the Manitoba Grocery Price Study, and they're describing it as a systematic examination of grocery price trends, looking at structural and market factors contributing to
Hmm.
food affordability challenges, and then also looking at a range of policy interventions that are available to the province, which I think is key because they're looking at, as government, what they can do to get data-driven solutions. So not just coming up with solutions that can be applied to retailers or supply chain, but looking at what government could be doing differently as well. So, important piece here. There's some things governments can control. There's other things they can't, but I think it's a big step. So some of the issues we've been talking about on the show in relation to affordability are going to be addressed. There's a fairly large scope for the study. So, it's ranging in they're looking at increasing impact of affordability measures, market concentration of grocery stores, which I think every jurisdiction is experiencing, low transparency on everything from supply to product availability. And I think, too, they've already framing out some of where they see some key issues, but also solutions. So, sort of ranging from things that they can control, again, as government fees, taxes, prices on groceries potentially, but also those new regulatory and policy measures where that can be some direct intervention. So we'll see what comes from this. Interestingly, I think, the now Manitoba conservative opposition was quick to say this wasn't an issue. So, I'm not sure that is shared by the public when we are
Yeah.
seeing this global or when they're seeing their
Thinking not,
grocery
Nikki.
bills. I'm thinking no, when
Yes.
when you go to the gym or stand at the bus stop, it's what people are talking about these days, let alone in the grocery store. So, the food insecurity and food security issues are extensive, I think, for all governments. And certainly as we decrease reliance on the US and look at exporting partners, there's aspects there that need to increase. But I think the ultimate goal for any government has to be figuring out how to at least do the work to try to get these prices down for the public and try to address what they can within their boundaries as well. But, there's potential help here for other provinces and jurisdictions with data that could be produced from this study.
Yeah. Yeah, that is good news. And I also saw maybe I don't know, maybe this is just a coincidence, but I saw that Ontario NDP leader Mart Stiles last week said she'd like to create a consumer protection watchdog with the power to dig into why food price hikes are twice as high as general inflation rate. So some people are kind of pushing to say, okay, like all these stratospheric ideas, it has to do with the money supply or it has to do with like that's all. Sorry, nobody's really buying that anymore. We know that there are specific supply chain problems, and I think some people are putting their toe forward, and I thank you, Wab, for being the first to say,
Mhm.
Let's actually look at the nuts and bolts here and figure out how we get some practical proposals on the table for Canadians, Manitobans, but everybody's going to see the results. It'll be fascinating.
Yeah,
All
exactly.
right, let's take a break, and we'll be back with our feature interview with BC Policy Solutions Iglika Ivanova.
We are really happy to welcome Iglika Ivanova to the show today. Iglika is the co-executive director of BC Policy Solutions. She also co-directs the Understanding Precarity in BC project, which is a research and public engagement initiative investigating precarious work and multidimensional precarity in British Columbia. An economist by training, Iglika has analyzed economic and social policy in BC for the past 18 years, which is pretty impressive. Her research has shaped policy conversations on public investment, affordability, and inequality. I think one of the things I personally really appreciate, both personally and in my professional life, about Iglika is the way that your work over the years helps make complex economic issues more accessible to a really wider range of audiences and those folks like me who are not economists. So, welcome, Iglika, to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, first of all, before we jump in, BC Policy Solutions is a relatively new organization. So, we wanted to give you a chance to tell us a little bit about it and what you're working on.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. BC Policy Solution is now 1 years old. We officially launched last February 2025. And we are an independent, nonpartisan research institute based out of Vancouver in BC. What we do is applied policy and economics research and public engagement. And the idea is to develop and advance policy solutions to the most pressing challenges that we face in BC and in Canada. So what we really want to do is we want to contribute to building a more just and sustainable future for everyone. And because of that, we are interested in building and developing solutions that put people and planet before profits. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. And we have a number of interesting projects that your listeners might be interested in and look out for. We recently released a report with Canadians for Tax Fairness on the
Mm.
state of wealth inequality in Canada, um, showing how, our economic system in this country is producing a few really big winners and many, many losers, and proposing policy reforms to share prosperity a bit more equitably. And we're also doing research on deep poverty, on the funding crisis in post-secondary education, on primary healthcare reform, on inequities in the housing market, all sorts of issues that really are impacting people living in British Columbia and in Canada directly. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. We really want to focus people's attention and policymakers' attention on collective responsibility and on the common
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And I do want to note too, like just because you are in BC, as you said, a lot of these economic policy discussions we're going to have are applicable across the country and issues that are facing working people and in many ways. So we appreciate you bringing those insights to our national audience because we are the East to West show here. So thanks for joining us for that too. So let's jump in a little bit because I think, as anyone alive right now knows who watches the news, tariffs are dominating the news cycle for the past year. And we've seen governments in all jurisdictions across the country, but globally as well, really pivoting on some commitments they may have made in election cycles or economic policy they were building from in their own mandates, largely with this major project and private sector investment priorities. So using those policies to build into economic goals. So, you have framed how tariff escalations can really intensify the economic pressure on workers and families, and then also key industries. From your perspective, what is the most overlooked way that tariffs ripple through the economy, especially for low and middle income households?
Yeah, that's an important thing to talk about. I do think that we've been hearing a lot about tariffs over the past year. And when you look at what's actually happened, the actual economic impact has not been as bad as we were worried, which is good, you know.
Yeah.
It really helped that we dropped the retaliatory tariffs when we did, because those tariffs were adding a lot to inflation and to costs for low income people. Uh, and also, Donald Trump backed down on some of the threats. So,
Hmm.
really, the impact has been very narrowly felt at the sectors that have been impacted by specific tariffs, like automakers in Ontario, steel, aluminum, forestry in BC, and um, everyone else. The impact really is the uncertainty of like what's going to happen, and that has led businesses to not invest, to hire less, and to slow down the broader economy. But really, in my mind, the worst impact of the tariffs is that they've entirely consumed the bandwidth of provincial and federal policymakers,
Hmm.
and we are completely ignoring domestic issues that were that haven't gone away. The affordability crisis,
Yeah.
housing crisis, the these things are public services that are stretched too thin, wait times in healthcare. Um, these things aren't going away, but we are pretending they're not there. And I think that's a really big challenge because we're focused on tariffs. And I think that that's really the way this is impacting vulnerable people, is that the stretched services and the lack of support is
Yeah.
leaving vulnerable people to fend for themselves. And we know in this country we have huge rural urban disparities in access to services, and that's just not being addressed at the moment.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so important because, I've been thinking about where those communities and local impact where a mill shuts down or where that sector's been impacted. And if people were already feeling precarious or having food insecurity or housing insecurity that hadn't been addressed in the last year because of this focus you talk about, just how amplified that is when the job losses come, right? So it is that sort of it feels like a lot of short term right now, but digging into that, what kind of policy tools do you think would actually most effectively protect workers while we're, as you say, looking at these global trade tensions? But what are some of the levers that we could be using differently to get ahead of the long term implications?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. When people start out being vulnerable, then these global pressures are only making things worse. And it's not just trade tensions, right? We also have other geopolitical tensions
Yeah,
aside from trade that, with the Trump administration saying they have some signaling some more imperialist interests, taking over
yeah,
territories of other countries, desire to control the Arctic and the resources there. So it's a challenge. It's a really big challenge. So thinking about what we can do as a government, especially, federally, we can do more things than we provincial governments can do, right? But we do need to be thinking about making decisions in the public interest, and not in the interest of the people and the companies that can afford lobbyists and that own the media and control the narrative. So I think that's really important because um, we just, as you said, have not been investing in some of those fundamental building blocks of prosperity, like like solving food insecurity, addressing people's basic needs,
yeah,
addressing the housing crisis. And at this point, if we do invest um, in that and we help people be healthier and communities be more dynamic and thriving, we are going to create jobs at a moment when the private sector isn't exactly hiring um,
yeah,
in droves. And we will build the resilience through equity, not through austerity, because I think it's really problematic to have deepening wealth inequality, to have this concentration of power, in various sectors in our economy where there's a handful of firms that control the market. And so that's dangerous. And I think if we um, if we make strategic investments in housing, in infrastructure that we need, will really help.
Yeah, I read a report that you folks did in the fall, and it was very much focused on the erosion of the public sector and its inability or eroding ability to make these kind of investments that can trigger or can push growth forward. Um, but also, the
British Columbia has done quite well on growth. Like since 2017, when we had a change of government in British Columbia, BC has had the fastest growing economy in Canada. But I know that that things really slowed down in 2023, 2024, quite sluggish. And we haven't got the numbers for last year yet, but the presumption is, again, it was below 2%. So there seems to be a shift, and it's not just in BC. We've seen a shift across the country to lower growth. How much is the fact that our economy isn't growing, and therefore not as many people are working, and not as many businesses are, paying corporate taxes, and not, just not as much commerce, so not so much, you know, how much is all of this kind of drag down on the ability of the public sector to raise the money to pay for the healthcare and the education and the other things that we want to do to invest in ourselves and try and trigger, restore growth.
Yeah, I mean, to a huge extent, that is a factor, and I think it's important to understand kind of why the economy is slowing, because there's a lot of competing arguments about that. But from my perspective, we had in the early 2020s, the bank as well after the pandemic, when the economy was recovering quite well, the Bank of Canada quite aggressively um, increased interest rates, and that was intended to slow the economy. Because from the perspective of the Bank of Canada, the economy was overheated and needed to be slowed down. So that's what we had the peak interest rates um, uh, in the summer of 2023, and then that caused a significant drag on the economy. And we had the global challenges with tariffs and now other geopolitical issues. So that's what's causing the economy to be so slow across Canada. It's not just Canada; it's the entire global economy that is
Mhm.
slowing. And so yes, this is eroding revenues across the country, but virtually all provinces, are tabling deficits. But I think if we look across the map, at least in 2025, 26, BC had the largest deficits. And so it's interesting to ask, well, is this just the economy or is something else going on here? And I think we need to remember that the carbon tax elimination hit hugely BC. We lost $2 billion in net revenue, and in perpetuity, that was paying for climate adaptation measures and for other things. And no other province lost revenue except Saskatchewan, which lost quite a bit less. So that's why BC is in a worse position than other provinces. They um, eliminated a big revenue source and did not replace it with anything. And
Mhm.
and I think that that's a big challenge. And that BC, looking across Canada, we're not particularly high tax country, but BC is one of the lowest tax provinces. And so, I think
Right.
we have to take that into consideration.
We
How
talked
much
about that
revenue are we willing?
Yeah, we talked about that in a recent show, Iglika, that, and this is, I think, probably surprising to a lot of people, that British Columbia, not Alberta, British Columbia on the income tax side is the least expensive income tax jurisdiction in this country, for until you get to about 150,000, and then it's more than in Alberta, where they have a flat tax, I guess.
Would
But
probably surprise British Columbians too, I think.
well, it's like, well, why don't people know this? And
Yeah.
anyway. But Gleeka, there's another interesting piece of your of what you're saying here about the role of interest rates, and just to pursue this for a sec, if you have any thoughts about this. But obviously, we were doing the interest rates because we had inflation. Bad inflation coming out of COVID. We had interest rates at basically zero, less than the inflationary. So it was like get free money, people spending $1 million houses, $1.3 million houses, real estate going nuts. And then the crushing change in interest rates to take try and empty the punch bowl before everybody falls down. But it just raises the question of, like, we did nothing really to stop inflation. And this is an ongoing debate here because, of course, we're seeing the resurgence of food inflation, and nobody's really talking about how to do anything about it. We're giving out tax breaks, but that doesn't do anything about inflation. So this inflation period seemed to be having a lot of knock-on effects that we're still living with.
Yeah, but see, here's where it gets a little more complicated because if you look at what actually caused the inflation that the Bank of Canada was worried about, it is not real estate prices, right? We've had a massive increase in the real estate prices in BC and I mean across Canada too, that predated that inflation, period, right? And the real estate is not a huge portion of the CPI, like the consumer price index, right? So it was a problem that low interest rates for a very long period of time post, the financial crisis were causing essentially an asset price increase in the real estate market. That's definitely happened, but that happened without, big CPI increases elsewhere. What caused increases post-pandemic, a lot of it were supply chain issues like transportation challenges,
Yep.
climate, the impact of climate on is
Yeah.
being huge on food prices. We have droughts affecting the production of beef. We have droughts affecting like vegetables, of disease. All sorts of climate related extreme weather or disease transmission type of events are affecting those prices. So I think it's unfair to say, oh, the housing prices were out of control, and that's why the Bank of Canada had to rein it in. And a lot of people, and myself included, think the Bank of Canada went too aggressively because the challenge, like the whole idea of why the Bank of Canada increasing the interest rate would slow down the economy is that people have too much money, spending too much money, and that's causing an increase. But it wasn't a domestic, like people have too much money situation. It really was what's happening globally with why the supply of these things. With food, we don't grow a ton of it here. We import a lot
Yeah.
of food. And so these things were driving prices to a large extent.
Okay. Now,
Yeah.
there's an issue that I think bridges from, you're an economist. We talk about politics a lot here, but we like the bridge in between. And so do the BC Conservatives. They're very anxious to build a connection, a political economic connection around the issue of treaties, land rights, and economic development. And the BC Conservatives are talking about disregarding treaty rights and really plowing ahead, and that's the way to, deliver jobs. But it seems to me, at least, that's really a kind of doomed and dumb way of going forward because treaty rights are part of our Constitution. You can't just override them. You end up in court. The jobs get destroyed. The people get divided. It's just a lot of negative things. So that's the politics of it. But do you have thoughts about the economic advantage of governments, businesses thinking about those partnerships and settling the questions, the outstanding treaty questions that exist, so that as kind of an alternate approach, economic approach for Canadian governments to pursue, other than this kind of like, well, let's just pretend that these treaties don't exist and pretend that the courts aren't going to, insist that in fact they do.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. That's the economic problem too, is that uncertainty is an economic problem. And, the fact that, these land rights do exist, court cases, famous court cases, the Delgamuuk and the Tucautin decisions show that they're not a suggestion. The land
Yeah.
rights are a legal, obligation or a legal right in Canada under the Constitution. So that's an important thing that I think is getting missed in some of the political conversation, is that it's, the DRIPA, the provincial law in BC, did not create land rights, right? They exist independently. And so even if we overturn DRIPA, that's not going to make the land rights go away. And I think it would be very scary for investors to hear that, someone wants to be plowing ahead, and overlooking rights, because that just means court costs, and the jobs that will be delivered will be, jobs for lawyers who are going to be, you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
who are going to be, working on these massive court cases that are going to take years and years. I mean, the Delgamuuk decision took 10 years. They usually take that long because they get appealed at all the possible levels.
Yeah.
So what this is going to do is just going to create a lot of uncertainty, and essentially asks for protests and legal court cases, to be challenged. And
Right.
I think it's really important that if we were to progress, in the other way, towards economic reconciliation, towards, partnerships and settling these things together, with indigenous people, I think that that's the way that prosperity lies. That's where
Hmm.
we
Mm.
can ensure that the future economic projects that we do are inclusive, that everyone supports them, and that creates stability, predictability, and that's what's necessary for resource development and resource stewardship.
Yeah. But not as great on TV. I mean, pictures of people get angry and divisive, that
But I
that
mean,
seems that seems to be a premium slot in the
Yeah.
news every day. So
yeah, but that's drawing on. I think it's really important to
yeah,
recognize that it is, kind of piling on this long history of discrimination, and
Yeah.
yes,
it's trading on fear and bigotry. That's what is
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
yeah,
And I think it's fascinating to me because I think, when it comes into the economic conversation, I think that certainty piece is actually the uncertainties being increased by politicizing DRIPA and these conversations. And it's not just happening in BC, right? We're seeing it at some national levels as well. But it is that politicization, I think, that's creating more of that investment uncertainty,
yeah.
quite frankly, than the current framework that we're
Yeah, like
working
Nikki,
with.
we were talking last week with Bryn Bork, and
Hmm.
you were making the point, like the former BC Liberals destroyed the trade skills system, and it took a long time for it to happen. But these things should be understood now. Like
Yeah.
that's just a bad thing to do. I don't care what party you're from. That's dumb. And it seems to me we should be trying to get ourselves into the space where we understand that thinking that you can evade the Constitution is just dumb.
Yeah.
And yeah, it whips people up and it gets people angry and they come to a town hall meeting, and people say some nasty things. And that's, it's great on Twitter, but it's not good for jobs. And I think that was her point. And the point in this anyway,
Yeah.
um, ranting on a bit, but it just rankles me. I am supposed to ask you about food inflation though. I want to ask you about food inflation a little bit because I saw an amazing clip of Daryl Jones. Okay, he's the guy who's running for he was one of the candidates for the BC Conservative nomination, and I don't know if other people saw this clip, but he's asked about, well, hey, you were formerly the CEO or president or whatever of Save On Foods, which is big grocery chain in BC owned by Jimmy Pattison, and like, what do you think about this food inflation thing? And he says, well, the price of coffee that's up because of Trump's tariffs. It's like, okay, I kind of understand that. And then he goes, and the other thing is the price of fertilizer has really gone up, and I'm thinking the price of fertilizer, that's your reason here, you know? And it was just he just melted down. So I thought this was a very bad interview, but this is something I think we're constantly challenged with to try and understand, even in a domestic product. We've seen how much basic poultry and meat has gone up. Those are Canadian products, raised in Canada, raised mostly in Western Canada, but also in Ontario, in Quebec, and sold. There's no foreign exchange issue here. There's not really major supply chain disruption issues here, but these prices are going up and up and up. What do you think about what do you think about where the sources of inflation lie here? And I guess more, and this is a little political, how do we go after them rather than a broad brushed way that is a little bit ill informed? There must be specific points in the supply chain that are creating the prices that we're seeing, and we don't want to attack it, everything and hurt and disrupt, damage the supply chain, but we certainly don't want it running like this anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see the interview, but it sounds like,
It's a classic.
definitely classic that he was trying to not talk about grocery chains and the role that they have, but point
Yeah.
fingers at everybody else. And while tariffs were a factor for a while, especially the counter tariff that we had on coffee, tariffs, I don't think are a factor on the price of coffee right now, and it's still very expensive. And I think it's really important for people to understand that these things are driven by climate change.
Yeah.
The coffee crops in many places, like in Brazil and Vietnam and other coffee growing regions, are failing because of droughts and other extreme weather events caused by climate change. And so that's happening to more and more kind of foods that we need the climate to be stable for them to grow. And beef, for example, is also being hugely affected by droughts in BC and in the prairies, and that has made it very expensive to raise cows, and to it's very expensive to feed the cows. The feed is becoming very expensive. And so that's resulted in, I was reading about that the other day, is that herds, the number of animals that are being grown, they're being reduced, and that we have fewer cows than than we
Yeah.
did in the late 80s. Where that's kind of how far back, but demand's still up, and that's what's causing high beef prices. And the Bank of Canada had a very good article, if people are interested, just released in early February on the explaining where the food inflation is coming from, and then a lot of it is linked to climate change.
Yeah.
But the grocery industry, let's talk about that, which I'm
Yeah.
sure that someone who's been associated with that doesn't want to talk about it, but it is highly concentrated. And then we know that we have a handful of large retailers that control most of the market. I think the Competition Bureau looked into them a few years ago because, grocers had massive, massive profits post-pandemic. And, then in 2022, there's 5 retailers that control 80% of market share in Canada in groceries. And they're able to exert a lot of pressure on suppliers to negotiate contracts where they really get the profit. And so I think in the beef processing as well, that's one of the other reasons for cost of beef. There's apparently 2 or 3, beef processing companies, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
So
I think
the
there's two. Like, I think there's JBS in
yeah.
Brazil, and then there's Cargill, which is the Cargill family from the United States. And they own the 3 major plants in this country, 2 in Alberta, 1 in Ontario. They control like a huge percentage of all the beef that we put on tables. Not Nikki, but the rest of us.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah. We touched on the non-meat eater. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I think it's important we have, the federal government's tried to, do something. There was this inquiry in Parliament and the Competition Bureau review. And then what came out of it is this grocery code of conduct that came into effect in January, right? It's voluntary, it's industry led. And what it is really focusing on is less on, capping prices or affordability, but on dealing fairly across the grocery supply chain, because even the grocers have had to admit that, yeah, they squeeze suppliers, and they squeeze the farmers, and so they've promised to be nicer and not to change the contracts unilaterally. And we'll see whether that results in any price decreases. But I really do think that competition is one very fruitful approach. Like, we just cannot be having this massive concentration of power in the market. We need to be more focused on making sure that they're not just profiting of people. There needs to be some limits on that.
Yeah, I saw some. If I can just do one more, Nick, this one, Nikki, because this just drives me nuts. I saw some data from from StatsCan. It says the price of beef, so the price of cattle, live cattle, sold to slaughterhouses is up pretty substantially over the past year. I think it was about 21%, and I'm sure that some of the environmental issues you're talking about are driving that. But the price of beef at the other end of the process, the actual that price that they pay to the farm is only about 40% of the total cost that we pay at the store. And yet the price of the store has gone up 25%. So wait a minute. It seems like everybody along the chain, there's some input price problems, but then everybody along the chain is riding on that and taking their own markup, and just inflating this whole thing more.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the tariffs, probably gave some people permission to be like, oh, well, tariffs,
Yeah.
what do you know? The prices are up because tariffs. And so, people, even when you go to the grocery store, you're shocked, but you don't really question. You're like, oh, I guess there's tariffs. And I think we do need to question, the profits that these middlemen are making and the grocery chains are making. Yeah.
I will also always remember in October 2021, we had the floods here, and on that climate resilience part, where I think I was doing a national media show, and we were talking about the economy, and it was within the hours. I remember trying to do this and talk about what's happening in BC, and I literally was like, well, our highway just broke and our agriculture land just flooded, and we're seeing the horrific photos of livestock. And so I think like we don't match up these concepts. Plus, as humans, we sort of forget about these big impacts, right? Because that has been such a huge, and we continue to have flooding here, atmospheric rivers being the new norm, feels like, and more flooding in the province. But that piece, I think, when it was like, what just happened to our highway and like all of this agriculture land in such a short period of time was pretty impactful that people don't connect into. So we're just going to a little pivot here for our last question as well, which is just I just want to touch on this before we break, because I think, we do talk a lot, and we have talked a lot about the private sector. We're hearing a lot about those major projects and private sector driving wealth, and that's where we're getting the funding for healthcare and education. So, there's though the public sector role in economic growth as well, I think is overlooked. So what can, provincially, what are some of those policy tools and resources that can be dealt with by legislators in this field?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, Nikki. And, I would like, I hope that we can soon retire this idea that public sector is a charity that is funded by
Yeah.
the real, so to speak, private sector economy. That's not how it works, right? The public sector is very foundational to the economy. The private sector does not create wealth in a vacuum. It cannot create wealth without a strong public system. Those businesses can't prosper without a publicly educated workforce, without roads and ports that we build, electricity transmission lines, public healthcare system, and transit for people to get to work. So I think it's important for people to, be thinking about how the public sector isn't just spending money on nice to have, services. It is investing in foundational components of
Yeah.
basic infrastructure that underpin private sector activity. So if we are starving the public sector, eventually that will ripple down to effects in the private sector as well, not being able to function as well. And so, I mean, what can we do? I really think we can be investing in those systems of care and education and social support. Right now, our public post-secondary institutions are just struggling because
Mm-hmm.
they have underfunding, right? And that
Yeah.
they were relying on international student tuition,
Yeah.
and that's being pulled out. So everyone is struggling. There's massive cuts, reduction in education. So I think, we do need to think about what this means for the future and for the kind of skills that we're going to have. Healthcare, also big challenges there. But it's
Yeah.
foundational here. The fact that companies don't have to pay for private healthcare the way they do in the US is a huge advantage, right? That the public sector provides. So I just wish
Yeah.
there was a little more understanding of how important that is. And energy, for example, like clean energy, BC Hydro is a public utility. And then, we have some of the cheapest clean energy, clean electricity in the North America. And it's massive subsidy to the private sector, right? And we're
Yeah.
now going to electrify LNG terminals, build a whole BC North Coast transmission line entirely funded by the public to support new mining and resource, LNG projects. So I think it's important to really to understand how foundational the public sector is.
Yeah.
Thanks
Good.
for that. And thanks for joining us. I know you're always really busy, and we appreciate you taking the time to help break down some of these issues for our listeners. And thanks for taking some of that policy lens from beyond our BC borders as well. So we include our Eastern and Central friends in these conversations. This is great.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Iglika. Interesting interview with Iglika, and good luck with her new organization. A lot here, Nikki, for us to think about. She makes some great points about how there's a lot of environmental damage that's driving the cost of living, right? Which is something
Yeah.
we kind of lose touch on, but we know it.
Well, I think we feel it when it spikes up, right? So I think we feel it when there's those floods, and we know that livestock have been lost, or we feel it when there's a wildfire. We know that impact is there, and then we naturally sort of forget in the meantime what some of those factors may be. But yeah, I think it's, as we think about what's driving up costs, I think, what Iglika tells us, it's just a bigger picture than what we
Yeah.
hear, from sound bites from politicians trying to drive certain agendas. There's a lot going on that needs to be impacted. I also just think this is probably a good time, Tom, just to note that we recorded with Iglika before the BC budget. So we didn't dig into that, even though this episode's coming to you after the BC budget. And I'm sure she would have had a lot of insights to share on that piece as well.
We'll get into that at another time, I'm sure.
We will.
Okay, well, let's then take a break and we'll come back with Love It or Heave It, okay?
Before we wrap up, we are at the part we call Love It or Heave It, something we love and something we want to keep, or something we want to heave and forever forget. What do you have this week, Tom?
Nikki, I am loving Toronto crime.
That's a bit of a surprise, Tom.
Toronto crime is way down. It is way down. In 2025, there were 48% fewer murders than in 2024. Auto thefts were down 25%, robberies down 19%, break-and-enters down 11%, sexual violations down 10%, and 3% fewer assaults. Everything down, 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 according to Toronto Police Services data. And that trend to a safer city has been holding up so far in 2026. So fingers crossed, hope this continues. Also, roads are safer. There were 42 traffic deaths last year, down from 78 at the peak in 2016. 21 last year, half of them were pedestrians, but that's down from 44 in 2016. So, Nikki, governments can get things done when they try. Toronto reduced side street speeds. It increased school crossing guards. It deployed more red light cameras. It narrowed corners. And these things are working. And people are not getting killed. That's kind of, I think, important. And one last little tidbit suggesting maybe Toronto is on the mend. A monthly survey by city street workers showed 64% fewer people living in encampments in December of 2025 than at the peak in November 2024. So the number of tents is also down 55%. But more to do for sure on all these issues, but finally heading in the right direction. Now, footnote, Olivia Chow promised a safer city when she ran and won the job in 2023. And this kind of data is no doubt part of why her approval rating is so high, ticking up from 53% in December to 55% in February.
Interesting.
According to Liaison's latest poll, elections are in October of this year.
Very interesting.
Hopefully I can keep hopefully I can keep loving a safer city. Nikki, what are you loving or what are you hating? Heaving.
I feel like I've got another serious heave this week. I'll try not to make my sections the Nikki's rants on serious topics, but it's another heave to the damaging impact of misinformation week for me, Tom, and I think another in the sense that politicizing complex issues and driving misinformation online really leads to consequences for real people, real consequences, real damage. So, and we're not just seeing this here in BC, but I think we have seen, in the last few years, this rise of residential school denialism causing increased anti-Indigenous rhetoric and hatred in community. But what we've actually seen in BC has First Nations leaders standing up with community leaders and pushing back. We've had a really, I think in the last 6 months or so, maybe a little bit longer, there's been a series of court decisions and that have come down that have put the concept about reconciliation and BC is one of the only jurisdictions who's committed to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, DRIPA, as we say. But I think, and there have been a lot of questions going on about what it means in real application coming out of those court decisions. But as we also see politicians trying to drive public opinion, quite frankly, with increased polarization and misinformation about what Indigenous title means, about what reconciliation and commitment and DRIPA means in this province, which is spilling over to other provinces. We are also seeing now, and I hear it anecdotally, and I think we're seeing it from First Nations leaders saying that people need to be aware of what is happening in communities, which is that rise of hate. So, I've talked to people in First Nations communities that are worried about their kids walking to the grocery store because they've had verbal attacks or worse. And so First Nations leaders are seeing this spike in hate. They're seeing it, not only in their email boxes or online, we certainly see it, but they are seeing it in their communities, and it's serious. So I think, we have to have debate on these issues very seriously and think about the fact that there's humans at the other end of some of these policy choices. And so my heave is using DRIPA and reconciliation to polarize and to spread disinformation, to really make the public feel more uncertain than I think they're already feeling right now, and spilling over to this increase of hate.
Yeah, I saw John Rustad, the once and maybe future Conservative Party leader, recently saying that First Nations wouldn't exist without Canada. And I just thought,
Yeah.
wow, what a bizarro thing to say.
Yeah.
How does that make any how does that make any sense? Um, Treaties are just
Yeah.
a part of our Constitution, and if conservative antics want to turn major projects into court fights, well, working people and Indigenous people, everybody's going to pay the price on this.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And
uh,
conservatives note, I think we see some conservatives still coming in with that, I think, a healthy debate approach and wanting to think about what public needs are. But we are seeing, particularly through the things like leadership races, kick up and just trying to
yeah,
make this a wedge issue, right?
yeah, yeah.
That is where we see, similar to anti-trans rhetoric, where we see that impact on people locally and could get really dangerous in some communities, which is where people are speaking out now. So
Yes, the radical right, my friends, they're
yeah,
going to screw it all up for all of us.
yeah, easy to do it online, right? And you have to see what impact you're actually having on people. So that is all we have for this week on our Love It or Heave It. Thanks for joining us on Left, East to West once again, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks for joining Left, East to West with hosts Nikki Hill and Tom Parkin. We love to hear your comments, ratings, follows, and shares. It helps people find us. To become a Left, East to West community member and to help us reach even more Canadians, subscribe using the link in the show notes. You can watch us on YouTube or listen wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Just search for Left, East to West and subscribe. I'm Doug Hamilton signing off for Left, East to West. We'll see you next week.